insightful and interesting, intriguing, in fact, to say about college football. We bring in Steve Deace from Michigan Podcast to break down the game we all love as we head toward a fall camp here rather soon. Steve, how we doing today?
Brother, we are less than 80 days until the most wonderful time of the year, and not even being a Michigan fan is enough to depress me from how much I love that time of year. So I'm excited to get the convergence of fall and colors and pumpkin spice, and then, of course, the greatest sport ever, college football. So I'm excited.
And Steve, as we dive into our first topic, I think that also confirms your enthusiasm for Michigan's season here. So Steve has put together a system that I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, ties into your total team talent rankings. So those kind of reflect your projections toward the over-under win totals across college football.
Yeah, where I do an overall roster evaluation, like I explained before. It's not a power rating where I'm necessarily going to W&L a game or what I think the spread on a game should be. I'm actually in the process of doing that right now in compiling my my preview, which is a projection for how I think the season will go. But when those win totals are going to come out in mid to late May, I want to get ahead of the market. I want to look for soft numbers. And so I'm looking for teams that my roster numbers say the overall roster is in a cycle up or cycle down, because then you might be in a position where you might get a soft number that you can take advantage of from a win total standpoint. I've been using this system for the last 4 years, and heading into this year, it's 69%. I think it's like 17, 9, and 1 or something like that since the 2017 season.
Numbers typically stick to my brain, Steve. I actually think I know your record better than you do. And I haven't committed it to memory. I think it's 19, 7, and 1.
Oh, okay. So it's better than I transposed a couple of numbers.
I believe that you did. Yes. I think you can hold me to that. 19, yes. 7, and 1 is extremely impressive and will win you some change in Vegas. No question about that. So looking at this season's over-unders, you had those released at some point here soon. So I want you to run down your over-unders for the 7 teams. And so I can also, as somewhat of a fringe betting guy, I can appreciate that you've got an odd number of teams. That's always key. And then I want to run some of my projections by you to see what. And then I got one team in particular that fascinates me from a win total standpoint in terms of the projection. So let's go with the overs first. So we've got Cal at 5.5. This is a team that's played 500 football under Jeff Tedford or under Justin Wilcox. I'm going back a few years, Justin Wilcox, and 11-20 though in the Pac-12. So by my money and based on your talent rankings, they've underachieved. But you think they're going to go over 5.5 this year? I
think this is an overreaction. This number to what happened last year. Cal was picked second in the Pac-12 North last year and was it was a disaster. It started being a COVID disaster from the beginning, with Justin Wilcox complaining about his own university's COVID policies, his own league's COVID policies. They had to play that first game. Remember, it kept getting moved, and they had to play it on a Sunday against UCLA. They just never got their bearings set. They also brought in Bill Musgrave, who's a pretty respected offensive coordinator, but he had no spring or anything else to work with these guys. So it's an entirely new system. And so I had my eye, once I looked at Cal's returning, and you asked me a lot of questions about them last time I was on. They just have a lot of super seniors, a lot of upperclassmen returning, taking an extra COVID year, or guys who are standard seniors returning. I've had my eye on what Cal's number was going to be all along. If it was lower than 6, I was going to fire right away as a best bet, because I was anticipating it would be an overreaction to last season, where, except for maybe a team we'll talk about a little later on, I don't know that we can glean a lot from teams that underachieved last year, given just how ridiculous last year was, particularly teams in the Big Ten and the Pac-12 with the restrictions they had and the stoppages and the restarts and everything else. And then you have an experienced quarterback returning in Chase Garber. He's taken him to bowl games before. I think Musgrave gets a full year now to implement his offense. You know, Justin Wilcox will put a respected defense on the field. So I think Stanford is down. I don't think Oregon State's very good. And I think Washington State is still down. So I think that there's not much of a middle in the Pac-12 this year. I think the top's actually pretty good. and they may all feast on one another. And then I think the bottom's not very good. And I think Cal, given the program that Wilcox has established, all I need them to do is get me to bowl eligibility. I think they can do that.
Justin Wilcox at one point had threatened to take his team across the California state border to practice, to prepare for the 2020 college football season. This is certainly a team that had a win total up here projected by Vegas that caught my eye as well. Illinois over 3.5, Brett Bielema's first season in Champaign.
When I do my roster breakdowns, I mean, Illinois is loaded with super seniors and senior upperclassmen. And we're not talking about a win total of 6 here. We're talking 3.5. To get to 3.5, ask yourself this question: who would you rather have your team built around? A guy who's a slightly higher rated recruit at Purdue, but he's a sophomore, or a guy that has spent 4 or 5 or 6 years in a Big Ten football program and in a Big Ten strength and conditioning program? I'd rather have the latter, dude. Okay. And then you throw in Brett Bielema's track record of success. You know, he didn't do great at Arkansas, but it wasn't like they were terrible. They were in a bowl game most of the time he was there. And then he's got an experienced quarterback in Brandon Peters. He had this team in a bowl game just a couple of years ago. So you give me the experience, you give me a head coach with a track record, and then you give me a quarterback that has proven to be dependable for them. And then you look at the schedule. I count at least 7 winnable games on the schedule. I don't believe they'll win 7 games, but can they win 4? Yeah, I do believe they can get me to 4 wins. And so I think I've got Illinois with an experienced quarterback, a proven head coach, and an upperclassman-laden roster up against a pretty workable schedule. And I've only got to get to 4-8. That's one of my best bets.
So, Steve, my system's a little less systematic than yours. I'll review the over-unders and see who catches my eye. Then, of course, I do the deep dive into the schedule, and then I factor in the attrition and the gains. And certainly, Illinois caught my eye for the same reason as it caught your eye. But then once I went to the schedule, because let's look at the Illinois history of scheduling out of conference games. My first thought was 3.5. They hardly ever play a Power 5 team outside the Big Ten. They usually load up on a bunch of Group of 5 and MAC teams. So that's the first thing I went to. They do have a date at Virginia, which will probably be an 80-20 type win-loss situation on Virginia's side. Texas, San Antonio, those are 2 of the out-of-conference games. Charlotte will be no gimme, but they should be a favorite playing that game at home. And then they dive into the Big Ten. Rutgers, no longer an automatic win. So I did find the wins to be less forthcoming than I anticipated before I jumped into the schedule.
I did it the other way around because ultimately I think talent wins, and I think schedule comes into play when you're looking at, if I'm evaluating, like if Ohio State and Georgia were in the same conference, I would look at the schedule, but they're not. So when I'm evaluating Ohio State against the rest of the Big Ten East, I don't look at the schedule at all. I don't care because the personnel numbers are so far ahead of everybody else that the schedule is nearly irrelevant. And my numbers of upperclassmen show that's just not a football team that's going 3-9 with a proven head coach. It's just not happening. So then I went and looked at the schedule to see, are there multiple games against Power 5 teams in the non-conference I didn't know or anything like that? I don't think Virginia is 80-20 at all. I don't. I think, first of all, they're going in that game with a better quarterback. So, I mean, I think that's probably more of a 60-40 because the game is in Charlottesville. I just think there's a lot of winnable games on there for a team that has a quarterback it knows it can win with. And again, he's not great. We're not asking him to be great. We're asking him to go 4-8. We're asking a guy that has dominated this division as much as any coach in the history of this division when we went in divisional format. And even prior to that, when a lot of these teams were just aligned together from an overall scheduling standpoint, I think 4-8 is a very attainable goal.
The one thing I will say to kind of back your point and go along the same lines is that I think we, by human nature, tend to be conservative and believe that things will just kind of stay the same. And I think I've told you in the past that I've gone through the major preseason publications, and they tend to be very conservative in their approach.
Mm-hmm.
And then I reviewed the previous season win-loss change, and I just determined that 3 was a significant number in regards to a increase or decrease in win totals from one season to the next, and saw where the major publications typically only pick a handful of teams across college football, looking at the Power 5, to either increase or decrease in win total by at least 3 games, where that number typically falls in the range of 18 to 23 teams in the Power 5. Like, that surprised me. So there will be teams, the last full season in the Big Ten in 2019, 5 of the 14 teams either increased or decreased win totals from the previous season by at least 3 games. So it happens. All right, Steve, the rest of these teams are underplays on your part. Brian Harsin and Auburn. And I think you outlined this number on one of our recent records, and I had already looked at that as well in regards to, we think of Auburn as being a top 10 to 15 team in the country year to year because their highs, they hit the highs, 2010, 2013, the SEC championship game in 17, but they lose 4 and 5 games every year other than those high peaks. And so 7 and 5, you're looking for the under this year with a difficult game at Penn State included. So
you mentioned a trend line, and every year I come out with preseason trends to go by. And the amount of seasons that Auburn has lost 4 or 5 games way outnumber, as you pointed out, the seasons they've done well. So, I mean, remember the year after Cam Newton, they went 3-9 and Gene Chizik was fired. That's more, I mean, the year after Gus Malzahn had them 1 play away against Florida State from winning the national title, they went 8-5 with virtually the exact same team. It was almost almost everybody came back on that team. When I look at this year's team, you get the SEC West, and it's a year where you get the SEC West, and then you have a road game at Penn State. And now you're bringing in a coach that's unfamiliar with the territory, has really no ties to the region on any level whatsoever, and it's an entirely new offensive scheme, Mark. I mean, they're going with more of a pro-style offense from Boise State, with Gus Malzahn, who couldn't spell fullback, let alone deploy one. I just don't think they have the personnel to run that. I like Tank Bigsby, but I don't think their offensive line's as good. I think the defense will not be as good. And I think the schedule is just too hard. And then you throw in a massive culture system change on top of that with an unforgiving schedule. I think if they get to bowl eligibility, they should consider that a decent first year.
And the other game, obviously, on the other side is Georgia, their annual matchup with the Bulldogs. That's maybe I'll throw that 80-20, and you might agree with me on that one.
I would agree with you on that one, yes.
All right. Our next underplay out of Steve here is we've got Colorado at 4.5 under, coming off a surprisingly successful truncated season in Carl Durrell's first campaign there in Boulder.
So Stephen Neuer, and I had this pick before their quarterback went into the transfer portal. That's kind of being spun as, well, he was injured. They weren't sure he was going to be back, and they've got young players there, and there may even be a lot of truth to that. This is also the guy that started every game last year. To me, I think the Colorado program is really who we saw in the Alamo Bowl against Texas when they just got the score named on them. And that's even after Sam Ehlinger got injured and knocked out of the game. They play both Minnesota and Texas A&M in the non-conference. I think those are both L's. And then you go into a 9 games conference schedule. So you're going to play 2 Power 5 teams that in recent history, the last 3 years, have 10-win seasons. And you're going to play both of them before you get to conference play. I think they lose both of those games. I don't see how, when I look at their personnel, I have 2 position groups are the only 2 that I don't have rated. I don't have them rated either the worst or the second worst team in the Pac-12. So I just think that that's not a team getting to 5 wins. I think last year, Carl Durrell, I'll give him credit. I think that shocked a lot of people that they were even mildly competitive at all. But I think that was a COVID outlier. Just because if you're going to have COVID outliers like Cal, we just talked about, right? In the Big Ten and Pac-12, schools that had all the COVID craziness from a regulation standpoint. Well, if you're going to have COVID outliers about disappointing performance, those teams are all playing each other, right? Okay. So if you're going to have if you're going to have outliers disappointing, then the symbiotic relationship of a schedule means that would then produce outliers of a what at the same time of a success. And I think when you throw in 2 Power 5 schools, I think this is I don't think they'll win as many games they won last year, and when they won 4, let alone get to 5. So I'm on the under for Colorado.
Yeah, Colorado, since their heyday, has pretty much been a 35% winning percentage football program, and they had an outlier type season in 2016 when they reached the Pac-12 championship game, and they got completely annihilated in the championship game and in the bowl game, and then they reverted back to norm the next year. Colorado, because of what they were able to accomplish last year, actually stuck out to me on the positive side initially. I did the dive on the schedule, thought about it, and actually came out with a similar result as you in predicting them to go under. So they were one of my 5 plays, Colorado under 4.5. So the next one surprises me. This is the first one that surprises me. Iowa 8.5. Not that the Hawkeyes couldn't go 8-4. That's pretty much Kirk Ferentz typical run there at Iowa, but that it's a confidence play by you.
Well, their baseline is they win 7 or 8 games no matter what, and then it's just a matter of what happens from there. Taking an under 8.5 is almost a value just on the Ferentz era on a yearly basis, number one. But number two, I don't like the quarterback. I thought they won in spite of him pretty much every game that they won last year. The 2 guys that anchored their defensive line are both gone. They had maybe the best receiving core they've had there since McNutt and Johnson Koulianos. Those guys are all gone. Then you have the schedule. You're starting off with Indiana, who I have power rated better than Iowa. You have Indiana, and even if Penix cannot play, the backup is good. I would have Indiana a 3 or 4 point favorite with Penix. I'd have the game basically a pick 'em without him. I think Indiana is pretty much better than Iowa at the majority of the other positions. So you're starting the schedule off with Indiana and at Iowa State. I mean, you could conceivably go 0-2 there, Mark. And then you'd have to go to get the over? You'd have to go, what is it, 9-1 the rest of the way? And their depth numbers, this is the lowest depth score since I've been doing team total talent ratings. This is the least amount of depth an Iowa team has had since I started doing this in 2017. And so we're talking about a developmental program. We're not talking about a school that just, hey, 1 4-star goes down, the next one comes up. Throw in the way the schedule starts, uncertainty at quarterback, the fact I don't think they'll be as good in the defensive line as they were last year when that really was a revelation to a lot of people. Davion Nixon came out of nowhere and ended up being, a second-day NFL draft pick. I look at all of those things. I think asking that team to get to 9-3 is too hard. So I'm on the under with confidence.
After they have their bye week in mid-October, this is a pretty difficult closing stretch. No elites, but just week-to-week difficult. Mm-hmm. At Wisconsin, at Northwestern, Minnesota, Illinois, at Nebraska.
I mean, they almost lost to Nebraska last year at home. So here's the thing I would say about Wisconsin, since you brought them up. I mentioned I'm doing some of the fundamental power rating preliminary work I will do that will then determine how I project the season to go when I put my preview out here in about a month. Since I've been doing this the last few years this way, I have been lower on Wisconsin than the market has been every year. My numbers have Wisconsin favored in every single game. My power ratings have Wisconsin undefeated going to the Big Ten Championship. In fact, my power ratings have 2 undefeated teams playing in the Big Ten Championship game. My power ratings are telling me that Wisconsin, so I may end up adding another over because it's 8.5 right now. I might decide to add another over here in another couple of weeks. But my power ratings are telling me Wisconsin might be the most underrated team in the entire country, that they are playoff level good, that the gap between them and the rest of the West is actually commiserate with the gap between Ohio State and the rest of the East. Now, granted, they're a different level of talent, right? And the second, third, and fourth teams in the West are a different level of talent than the second, third, and fourth teams in the East. But I'm talking about the size of the gap, not the nature of the teams, but the size of the gap is similar.
I've got Wisconsin on my board for an overplay as well, and wasn't necessarily a slam dunk, but I was certainly looking at it. All right, your beloved Wolverines, 8 even. They should never throw us 8 even or an even number, but they've got Michigan riding right at 8-4, and you've got them under.
I think this number is at least a game or a game and a half too high. I think the odds makers know this, but you're dealing with arguably the largest and wealthiest fan base in all of college sports. And so you almost have to inflate it to a point to avoid having too much liability if they do catch fire, because we are talking about a team that has averaged a top 10 recruiting class the last 4 years. Okay. So there is, if I'm an odds maker, I'd be concerned. Okay. All right. I put the real line, which should be 6.5 or 7. I put the real line on it. And then I get killed, like what happened with LSU. Remember this happened with LSU a couple of years ago, right? So they were supposed to suck. This was the first year under Joe Burrow. They were opening the year with Miami. The over-under on that season was 6 or 6.5. Everybody, they got so exposed because so many people just bet LSU on the over blind, just on recruiting rankings, and that team ended up, winning a New Year's Six bowl. So I think the lesson of that, plus the power of the Michigan brand, is why this number is this high. It should not be. I mean, keep in mind, this is a team that was loaded with NFL players in 2019 and had a 5-star quarterback and won 9 games. I would argue against a weaker schedule than this. So they don't have a quarterback established. They have an offensive line coach that's never actually coached the position ever. The defensive coordinators never coordinated a defense. When the first defensive call he makes against Western Michigan on September 5th will be the very first time he's done that in his entire life. And then there's another assistant coach on defense that's never, ever coached on defense or anywhere else in college ever before. Then you look at the schedule, right? You've got, and here's the thing, we're talking about a program under Jim Harbaugh that if they're clearly better than you, they bully you. But they have 1 win in 6 years, Mark, where they were an underdog, and it's because about 3 books had Michigan a 1-point underdog instead of a 1-point favorite against Notre Dame in that rainstorm in 2019. That if you are as good as them or better, they wilt. They wilt on you. We saw this last year. When they could roll Minnesota, they did. They took a punch in the mouth from Michigan State, it was done. Took a punch in the mouth from Indiana, they were done. This is a program under Harbaugh that for 6 years does not get up off the mat. If they can bully you, they do. But if you can punch back, they don't get up off the mat. They kind of almost did a couple of years ago against Penn State, but then they drop a pass, lose the game. So what's it matter if you lost by 7 or when it was originally 21-0? So I look at a schedule with a lot of teams on it that can punch back or punch first. Washington, Indiana, Michigan State, at least they can do it when they play us. Ohio State, Wisconsin. Tell me, I count 2 games where I think they are 80% or higher to win. Western Michigan and Northern Illinois. Those are the only 2 games on the entire schedule. I think they're 80% or higher to win.
And of course, when the number's a whole number and not a half, then you're not looking to come out with a push, but you can always make that consideration that if you really like one side of it, what does that team have to accomplish for you to lose money?
Go for it. You're right. Yes.
They got to go 9-3.
They got to go 9-3 against that schedule with that team, with 6, actually 7 now, because Mo Linguist left last month to go coach Buffalo, so now they're on a 7th new assistant coach. 7 new assistant coaches, an unestablished quarterback. A completely revamped, overhauled defensive front, or defensive scheme, I should say. The only time this whole firing the coordinators thing and starting over has worked, I can remember. Almost every other time this is done, it's a precursor to the coach being gone the next year, okay? The one time it did work is Brian Kelly did it at Notre Dame in 2016 after they went 4-8. And the rest is they said they went 10-3 the next year, then went to the playoff, and then went 10-3 and back to the playoff. Every other school I can think of where the coordinators or they did a massive reshuffling, every other school I can think of where that was done, the coach was gone the very next year. So we're coming into this with with what is the identity of the team, Mark? You tell me. What is it?
The identity of the team is Jim Harbaugh standing on the sideline.
That's it. Yeah. The offensive coordinator has outside of 3 games, the rest of his body of work has been brutal. The offensive coordinator is a joke. The defensive coordinator is a rookie. Other than that, we're all fine here. We're all fine. How are you? I don't see how that team goes 9-3. I think this is a year that Jim Harbaugh is either Big Ten Coach of the Year or he's gone.
A week 2 matchup against Washington is going to be intriguing because from a talent perspective and from where the teams stand, at least on paper, it should be a very competitive game and could make or break the season. All right. And then finally, Justin Fuente at Virginia Tech. So he turned in a pretty much Virginia Tech, Frank Beamer type of first couple seasons. He's under 500 since then. And the Hokies are sitting on 7, and you've got them going under.
So this was a 500 team last year. Their last 2 recruiting classes have been really bad, man. I mean, like some of the couple of the worst classes in all the Power 5, bad. And here's why that matters. They were a 500 team last year, and pretty much everybody that made them a 500 team last year is gone, either in the NFL or the transfer portal. So I don't trust the depth numbers that are coming in, the next wave of players. I don't trust it whatsoever. I don't think, and I can't remember what job it was that he flirted with a couple of years ago, but it just seems like he's lost all of his momentum as a coach ever since then. I think they've been passed by Bronco Mendenhall and Virginia in their own state. I don't see, similar to Michigan, I look at that roster and I look at the questions and I look at the schedule. I don't see where there's an 8th win on that schedule. I don't see where there's a 9th win on the Michigan schedule. So if you're telling me, the worst I think I'm going to do is a push on a whole number, I'll go for it. Especially for a coach that I think is on his last legs.